November 22, 1963. A president is shot dead on a sunny street in Dallas, Texas. Within 48 hours, his accused killer is also dead, shot on live television before he could ever stand trial. What followed wasn't just a national tragedy. It was decades of missing evidence, sealed files, and a government that admitted, years later, it hadn't told the American people everything. This is the story of how one of history's most famous investigations may have failed the very people it was supposed to answer to, and how that failure still shapes the way an entire country looks at its own government today. To understand what happened in Dallas, you first have to understand who John F. Kennedy was, and why so many people, inside and outside his own government, had reason to want him gone. By 1963, Kennedy was one of the most popular presidents in American history. Young, photogenic, married to a glamorous first lady, leading the country through the tensest years of the Cold War. His family name alone carried enormous weight. Kennedy had come from money and political ambition, the son of a father who had spent decades building influence in business and government, determined to see his children rise to the highest levels of American power. By the time John Kennedy reached the White House, the family had already tasted both triumph and tragedy, and the nation had grown fascinated with their image, the photogenic children, the elegant First Lady, the sense that America finally had a modern royal family of its own. But behind closed doors, Kennedy had made powerful enemies. He'd clashed repeatedly with America's military and intelligence leadership, reining in covert operations, resisting pressure to escalate in Cuba and Vietnam, and even removing top intelligence officials he felt had grown too powerful and too secretive. Early in his presidency, Kennedy inherited a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba, using a small army of Cuban exiles to invade the island at a place called the Bay of Pigs. The operation was a disaster. The invasion force was quickly overwhelmed, and the promised American air support Kennedy had been assured would be available never fully materialized the way the CIA had planned. Kennedy publicly took responsibility for the failure, but privately, he was furious with the intelligence community. He believed the CIA had misled him about the operation's chances of success, and in the aftermath, he moved to limit the agency's influence, reportedly telling aides he wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Whether or not he ever said those exact words, the sentiment behind them was real, and it left senior intelligence officials furious and sidelined. Then came October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. American reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 tense days, Kennedy resisted enormous pressure from his own military advisors, many of whom favored an immediate airstrike or full invasion of Cuba. Instead, Kennedy chose a naval blockade and quiet, painstaking back-channel diplomacy with the Soviet Union, eventually negotiating a resolution that removed the missiles without triggering war. To supporters, this made him a steady, courageous hand in the most dangerous moment of the nuclear age. To critics inside his own government, particularly hardliners in the military and intelligence establishment, it made him look weak, even reckless with America's global standing, at a moment when they believed decisive force was the only language the Soviets understood. By 1963, Kennedy was also quietly exploring ways to de-escalate the growing American involvement in Vietnam, a war his own generals and many in the intelligence community believed needed far greater commitment, not less. Multiple aides and biographers have since suggested that had Kennedy lived and won re-election in 1964, he intended to significantly scale back America's presence there, a policy reversal that would have directly undercut years of military planning and strategic investment. In the eyes of some of the most powerful men in Washington's defense and intelligence establishment, Kennedy wasn't just disagreeing with them, He was actively dismantling the architecture of American Cold War strategy that they had spent years building. This is the environment Kennedy was operating in when he arrived in Dallas on the morning of November 22, 1963, for what was meant to be a routine campaign-style visit, part of a broader trip through Texas designed to shore up political support ahead of the following year's election. He rode through downtown in an open-top limousine alongside his wife Jackie and Texas Governor John Connally, waving to cheering crowds lining the streets. The mood was celebratory. Thousands of people had turned out, and by all accounts the president seemed relaxed, even pleased with the reception, joking with his wife just moments before the motorcade turned onto Elm Street and passed the Texas School Book Depository. Then shots rang out. Kennedy was struck in the neck and head. Governor Connally was also wounded, struck in the back, chest, wrist, and thigh. The president was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead less than an hour later, at the age of 46. Within hours, police arrested a 24-year-old former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald, who had briefly defected to the Soviet Union before returning to the United States a few years earlier with a Russian wife. Oswald worked at the Texas School Book Depository, the building police believed the shots came from, and a rifle was recovered on the 6th floor. He denied shooting anyone, famously telling reporters, "I'm just a patsy," an old-fashioned term for someone framed to take the blame for something they didn't do. But before he could ever stand trial and answer for the accusation in open court, he too was killed. 2 days after the assassination, while being transferred between jails in front of a crowd of reporters and police officers, Oswald was shot and killed on live television by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, who pushed through the crowd and fired a single round at close range. With Oswald dead, there would be no trial, and no chance for the public to see the evidence tested and challenged in open court, the way the American justice system was designed to work. It meant the official story of what happened that day would be shaped almost entirely by government investigators, rather than tested by cross-examination and public scrutiny in front of a jury. Within days, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had already reached a firm conclusion. Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, foreign or domestic. This conclusion came before any formal investigation had meaningfully begun. Newly declassified phone recordings between Hoover and the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, reveal Hoover pushing this narrative from the very start, describing a wider public investigation as something to be avoided rather than welcomed, and expressing concern that competing investigations from multiple agencies and committees would create public chaos and confusion rather than clarity. 7 days after the assassination, Johnson formed a commission to investigate what happened. It became known as the Warren Commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren. The commission included senators, congressmen, and notably, a former CIA director, one of the very agencies whose covert operations had put it at odds with Kennedy while he was alive. The choice raised eyebrows even at the time, though the commission was publicly presented as a bipartisan group of respected, high-integrity Americans assembled specifically to reassure a shaken and grieving public that the truth would be found. The Warren Commission spent roughly 10 months investigating, interviewing more than 550 witnesses, and reviewing thousands of reports supplied largely by the FBI and Secret Service, agencies that were, in effect, investigating themselves and their own handling of presidential security that day. In September 1964, the commission delivered its conclusion in an 888-page report. Lee Harvey Oswald acted entirely alone, firing 3 shots from the 6th floor of the depository, one of which was responsible for wounds to both Kennedy and Governor Connally, a theory that came to be known as the single bullet theory. According to the commission, that one bullet passed through Kennedy's neck, then continued into Connally's back, through his rib, out his chest, into his wrist, and finally into his thigh. A single projectile responsible for 7 separate wounds across 2 men, and it was recovered afterward in remarkably pristine condition for what it had allegedly just done. The report was almost 900 pages long, and almost immediately it drew skepticism, including from some of its own members and from the people who had lived through it firsthand. Governor Connally himself publicly said, more than once, that he did not believe he and Kennedy had been struck by the same bullet, insisting he felt a separate impact. Even President Johnson privately expressed doubts, later telling a journalist he suspected the assassination might have been retaliation tied to Cuba, given the ongoing covert American efforts to remove Fidel Castro from power, efforts Johnson himself was aware of, but which never became part of the Warren Commission's public findings. For over a decade, most Americans had never even seen clear film of the assassination. That changed in 1975, when the Zapruder film, a home movie shot by a bystander that had captured the shooting in graphic detail, finally aired on national television. To many viewers seeing it for the first time, more than a decade after the fact, what they saw didn't obviously match the official account they had been told for over 10 years, and it raised uncomfortable new questions about the timing and direction of the shots. By the mid-1970s, American trust in government institutions was collapsing for other reasons too. The Watergate scandal had just forced a sitting president to resign in disgrace. Investigative journalists and congressional hearings were surfacing new revelations about secret CIA operations abroad, including assassination plots against foreign leaders that had been hidden from the public for years. The country was still reeling from the drawn-out, deeply unpopular war in Vietnam, a war many now believed the government had misrepresented from the start. Against that backdrop of eroding trust in nearly every major institution, Congress reopened the Kennedy investigation. The House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded in 1979 that there was a high probability 2 gunmen had fired at Kennedy, suggesting the original Warren Commission investigation had been too narrow and had settled on a single, simple conclusion far too quickly. The committee directly criticized the FBI and CIA for withholding information from investigators during the original inquiry. In one particularly striking piece of testimony, an FBI agent stated under oath that he had been personally ordered by his superiors to destroy a letter Oswald had written to the Bureau shortly before the assassination, evidence that, by definition, the public and the original commission never got the chance to see or weigh for themselves. It's worth noting that the House Committee's conspiracy conclusion leaned heavily on an audio recording that seemed to capture the sound of additional gunshots. That recording was later challenged by other researchers and government experts, some of whom concluded it may not have even been recorded during the assassination at all. But the more lasting and important finding from that committee wasn't really about the number of shooters. It was the confirmation in an official government report that federal agencies had cherry-picked evidence and withheld information from the American people during the original 1964 investigation. In the years that followed, public fascination with the case only grew. Researchers and amateur investigators pored over crime scene photographs, zeroing in on unexplained details, like a mysterious man seen standing at the edge of the crowd, holding an open umbrella on a clear, sunny day, a detail some believe could have been a signal to a second shooter, though it was later explained by the man himself, who came forward decades afterward with an account historians generally regard as plausible. Other theories pointed toward organized crime figures who had reportedly expressed anger at the Kennedy administration's aggressive crackdown on the mafia. Some pointed toward Cuban exile groups embittered by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Others speculated about rogue elements within the CIA itself, unhappy with Kennedy's efforts to curtail their operations. None of these theories has ever been proven with hard evidence, but in the absence of full transparency from the government, all of them found fertile ground to grow. Public pressure for full transparency kept building over the following decade, fueled further by a major Hollywood film in the early 1990s that dramatized alternative theories about the assassination and reached a massive worldwide audience, reigniting public debate about what the government still hadn't disclosed. In 1992, responding to that renewed public demand, Congress passed a law ordering the release of all government records related to the assassination by the year 2017. A review board was assembled and spent years combing through the surviving documents, uncovering more inconsistencies along the way. Investigators found that the Secret Service had destroyed original motorcade route sheets and surveillance materials from that day, records that could have clarified exactly how security had been organized and where personnel were positioned. They found unresolved discrepancies surrounding the president's autopsy records, which differed in key details from what doctors at Parkland Hospital had initially observed and documented in the moments right after the shooting, before the president's body was transported elsewhere for a second, official autopsy. Some original medical photographs and records were later found to be incomplete or inconsistent compared to contemporaneous witness accounts from the doctors and nurses who treated Kennedy in his final moments. By 2017, roughly 5 million pages had finally been made public through the National Archives, closing out one of the longest declassification efforts in American history. But even now, decades later, a small number of documents remain classified, still withheld by the CIA, more than 60 years after Kennedy's death, a detail that continues to fuel speculation about what, if anything, is still being protected, and why an assassination from another era of American history would still require secrecy in the present day. Here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Even after millions of pages were released, no single definitive piece of evidence has surfaced proving a conspiracy beyond Oswald acting alone. But that's exactly the deeper problem. The government had the opportunity to release this information transparently in the 1960s, when trust in American institutions was still relatively high and could have been maintained through openness. Instead, key evidence was buried, altered, or destroyed for decades. Investigations were narrowed before they properly began. And by the time the documents finally came out, the damage to public trust was already permanent and, in many ways, irreversible. That's the real legacy of the Kennedy assassination investigation. Not necessarily a hidden second shooter waiting to be discovered in some final classified file, but a hidden pattern of institutional secrecy, one that taught generations of Americans to instinctively doubt official explanations from their own government, for better or worse. It reshaped how an entire country relates to the idea of an official story, and that skepticism has outlived nearly everyone who was actually alive on November 22, 1963. 60 years later, we still don't have every answer, and it's entirely possible we never fully will. What we do have is a case study in what happens when a government chooses control over transparency in the aftermath of a national tragedy, and how even when the truth eventually does come out, piece by piece, decade by decade, it can arrive far too late to repair what was lost in the meantime. If you want more hidden chapters from American history, the ones institutions took decades to even partially admit, make sure you're subscribed, because there is a lot more we're going to uncover.